Hello, everybody, and welcome back to our breakdown, our chapter weekly breakdown of Robert B. Davis II's book, Purpose in Form, The Necessary Basis of All Ethics. How are you doing today, Rob?
Pretty good. How you doing?
Doing well, thank you. Today we are going through chapter 14. It is entitled A Modern Religious Story. So, Rob, could you please kind of give us an explanation of the chapter, general overview, and maybe some of the goals that you're trying to bring across, some of the points?
Yeah. So the story is, or the chapter is about laying out a story, offering a story, and it's the culmination of the first two parts of the book. So the first part is about things we've done poorly, things that are stories that aren't working, even though we generally accept them. And then the second part has been building up to, okay, what do we need to include? What are the basics that we need to stick to? And so now I'm offering a religious story, a story that hopefully will appeal to modern readers and but also contain the necessary elements of foundational truth in it to actually function as a effective religious story. And so the first part of the chapter, there's the story's the last part of the chapter. The first part, there's first two parts of setup. And the first one is sort of talking about stories in general and going over again, uh, without saying metaphysics, but all the arguments that we've laid out for metaphysics. Why do we need a story? Um, and looking at the claims that people have made that we don't need a story. And then from there, looking at some of the caveats with bringing up a story and saying, here's a story that contains truth, but we still need to relate to it as a story, not as a how-to textbook or something like that. So there's the setup, two steps, and then get to the story itself.
So I think this chapter is broken down very well. So before we get into the story, like you said, the first part is describing kind of the importance of stories. Why do we use stories? And then what are the points against stories? Do they hold up? Is there a reason why we shouldn't have stories? You bring up somebody in particular, again, our dear friend, Mr. Harari, um, and he pretty much flat out states that stories are unimportant. Um, if he were here right now, Rob, what would you say to Mr. Harari in regards to that?
Well, well, I think he does a little bit more than say stories are unimportant. He says stories aren't important, and then he says, but I'm going to use stories anyways because we need
Right,
to.
right.
And I would just say, like you got to pick one or the other. You don't get to be inconsistent. You don't get to just say, well, I'm going to be inconsistent and then just move on. If
Yeah.
it's okay to be inconsistent, then you can't really criticize anyone at any time for anything because anyone can just be inconsistent. So, I mean, we could have an argument about consistency and truth, but that's a separate argument that you have to make. So, he spent the issue is though that really that he spends a lot of time deriding stories and saying that they're getting in our way and that they're problematic and it would be good to get rid of them. So it's like, okay, do you mean that? Because then he goes and says, "But we need them, so here's my version of the story." And then anything that he's pushing along is he's doing in some form of a story. So I mean, it's just clear inconsistency, and he recognizes that it is inconsistent, but his take is just like, yeah, that. So I mean,
I
I
mean,
would
why?
just say it.
I mean, why? Why? do you think that stories are so important to us? I mean, is it because it's just easier for us to grasp and to hand down through time as opposed to, if let's say you don't want somebody to eat a particular berry, you don't want your kids to eat a berry, instead of saying, hey, don't eat this berry, you make up some whimsical story about, these berries that the seeds sprout in your stomach and then, berries are going to come. I don't know, but it just kind of sticks a little more in
Yeah.
that. And I think that's a way to really to show that progress in humanity that everything just kind of blossoms and spreads and it builds upon each other as opposed to you know if you didn't have anything like that there wouldn't really be the ability to have people learn from mistakes or to really transfer that knowledge, that information, that wisdom from prior generations through. And of course, you're going to get some telephone, you're going to get some things kind of lost in translation. Entire languages lost, of course, but nonetheless, certain stories have been around for thousands of years because they contain that level of truth. And even people that might not understand these stories on some level see that truth and cherish it and want to, pass it down from generation to generation.
Yeah. Yeah. There's definitely a really strong evolutionary case for the effectiveness of stories in terms of their importance. And that's both on the genetic level of evolution as well as the cultural level of evolution. Even if you don't believe in cultural evolution, the transmission of stories is nevertheless very significant, and on that separate level. But then I would say it goes further too, and this is sort of what Jordan Peterson has been trying to get through for years now, is that it's not just that stories are exceptionally effective, it's that we are stories. We are embedded in stories, we live a story, we see a story, everything we do is story. So like neurologically, biologically, phenomenologically, the way that we process information is story based. And analytic process is a sub process within a wider field of story apprehension. So it's not just that stories are happen to be successful and effective, it's that stories just are foundational.
Yeah, no, I agree. And like you said, the analytics, everything is inside kind of that macro idea of a story. And that's, I never really thought about that, but you're absolutely right. Everything that we do is essentially story based. Whether we're looking at it externally or intrinsically. When we look back on our past, I mean, it has a beginning and then it has an end, an unknown end. Everything's just kind of flows in that way, kind of in a even though it's not linear due to the infinite potential when you reflect back and you see just that causality that just from one decision to the next, that then seems linear. I mean, of course, you
Mhm.
can think of the potential outcomes from the past, but I mean, the actual past is that linear line. And so you can't really help but conceptualize it as being a story.
Yeah.
It's
Well, and
wild.
if if we've done our job and the book has done its job in making the case that purpose and form is completely necessary and inevitable, then purpose it once something is purposed, then it is a story. A purpose is a story. It entails a uh, a limited place with some sort of need, conflict, desire, whatever it is, something to fulfill, and a possible fulfillment. So going from the place of A to B through the obstacle in the middle, that's a story. Basically, all stories right there is
Right.
some need, some obstacle, and the either successful fulfillment of that or the failure. But either way, as long as there is a potential purpose, you are in the realm of story. So if we've done our job in convincing you that purpose and form is necessary and automatic and inevitable, then that means that story is the same.
Right. And we'll get into the importance of uh, obstacles as well a little later on.
Mhm.
So also I want to talk about bottom of page 279. You say before we really go further into the modern religious story, we must first clear up the ideas about truth in stories. And so you have three specific points that you make here. If I may, I'm just going to run through those three real quick, and then
Yeah.
if you can kind of touch on that. So, first of all, as we have demonstrated, the value of truth is inseparable from the reality of the infinite. Uh, Secondly, you point out that one must be very clear about what is meant by fictional when referring to all stories as fictional. And then thirdly, you point out that we must seriously consider the urge to drop all stories. Um, could you kind of give us a breakdown on that and just kind of fill in the gaps on that?
Yeah, so that's sort of the cap on rebutting Harari. So uh, obviously we've talked about several times you need truth. If there's no truth, then we shouldn't talk. There's no point in us having a conversation. There's no point in listening to us. Nothing's making anything better. So that truth is there. Even if you say it's not, you're saying that it's true that truth doesn't exist. So and uh, then Harari's talking about sort of the juxtaposition between science and myth or story. And he's saying, all human stories are made up. All human stories are fictional, is the word he uses. And I just, point out, drawing on the context of how he uses that word, he's basically using that to mean unimportant, not real, uh, untrue, essentially. And so that's a particular narrative, that's a particular story around what fiction is and its value in the world. That fiction is just this trash throwaway stuff that's, there to tickle your mind or whatever, but does absolutely nothing else. And that would be contrasted to another view that would say fiction is not attempting to be scientifically accurate, but it is attempting to resonate with some reality and to hope, in some cases at least, play with and expose some aspects of reality. And maybe it does that well, maybe it does it poorly, maybe it distorts what it should be doing. But that's a different lens to look at fiction through than unimportant junk. Uh, and then the third one, in light of all that, I'm saying we need to seriously consider the urge to drop all stories, meaning we need to seriously consider that and think about how ridiculous it is. So the the and again, Harari uses these stories. He uses story, and he even after he says we should drop all stories, he's like, "But I'm going to use stories because we have to." You can't. Then your whole argument is just doesn't work. So like, there's no reason to believe that it's would ever be effective to drop all stories, which he himself admits. So why are we making this claim that we should drop all stories if we also recognize that we can't and we won't? Um, but he also in his argument does this, and I think this is an important point to specifically touch on. He does this around making a claim that our true nature, I think is how he puts it, our true nature is not a story. Like the essence of who we are is not a story. Now, that might be true. I even have some sympathy with that to say that the essence in itself of who we are is not a story. Fine, but that has nothing to do with whether or not the meaning of life or significant truths that are useful to our lives can be communicated in a story. There's this weird jump that he makes and is just sort of brushed over, but the idea that we, because stories aren't this, because our own nature, our true nature is not a story, therefore all stories are useless or irrelevant. Like that one does not lead to the other. You could have, it could be true that your true nature is not a story. That doesn't mean stories are not essential to your life or helpful even in your life, to say even less. So it's not clear how or why you would step from your true nature is not a story, therefore all stories are bad. That's just kind of a wild leap that is underlying his argument there. So I think it's worth noticing that there's sort of a bait and switch there where he says, well, stories are all fictional, and plus your true nature isn't a story, so we should drop all stories. Well, but that's a disconnect. That's a non sequitur.
Right. It seems like it's just like you said, extremely contradictory. I mean, there are no parameters for truth in the argument as a whole anyway. If you're from the lines of nihilism, you need that kind of backdrop or that anchor to reflect everything off of. And that would be the truth. And that's interesting. It doesn't really make sense. What is he specifically referring to when he says the essence of who you are?
Right. Well, I mean, I could make a charitable case for him. I think he has some in that book in 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. He talks about some meditative states that he's experienced. And I mean, they sound somewhat profound, but the idea of, well, you need to experience your true self or your true essence or whatever it is. Okay, but you've just told me a story.
Right.
You need to do something. You are in a place where you haven't done it. You need to get to where you have done it. That's a story of a journey. Um, so even if it was true that I needed to experience my true self, and my true self is not a story, it's something outside of story, it's still clearly the case that a story is going to be part of me getting there. So it's just irrelevant. I mean, they're just not connected. Like they're completely compatible with each other. You can have story and the importance of story and your true self being something beyond story. That's completely fine. These are not incompatible things. So it does not work to set that up and say, well, because you need to experience something that's beyond story, therefore you have to drop all stories. Again, to say you have to drop all stories is a story.
Right.
That's saying that you are in a place where you're plagued by stories, clouding your vision or whatever, and you have to do some sort of arduous journey of casting those out or laying them down or whatever it is. You have to go through a process of doing that to get to the goal. That's a purposeful story. So again, there's always going to be a story.
Right. And I think specifically about it's a nonfiction book called Unbroken, and it's about Louis Zamperini. Incredible story of just overcoming and sacrifice and um, being persistent and just incredible qualities. Set in World War II, he became a POW in Japan, and I mean that's a book on his life presented as a story.
Mhm.
And then you can go to any library or anywhere, and find a fiction book of a character that never existed, but that character, that fictional character, is a vessel to present truths to the reader, similar as I would learn from reading about a real life hero like Louis Zamperini.
Hmm.
One contains dragons, the other is, of course, reality based. So I think that really sheds light on the importance of stories, and not only stories, but fiction.
Hmm.
What does it matter if something is nonfiction or fiction if it's a means for the author to present truths to the reader?
Right.
That story is then just a vessel. You specifically touch on, if I'm going to go back here, and this is just kind of interesting as well, because I know, and this may ruffle some potential feathers, but I do want to bring up this point. Uh, Page 280, you say, we should not be concerned whether the Christian story is scientifically accurate in all its details. We should be concerned with whether the story conveys truth and how effectively it does so. And I'm bringing that up because, of course, the Bible is the most influential book in human history. And you have many people that are completely, I don't want to say the word obsessed, but I'll use the word meticulous. They are meticulous in breaking down the Bible analytically and intellectually to find out where the meat and potatoes is, as opposed to somebody that reads it, and they might read it as just like you said, like a story, and still gain the truth and the wisdom held within. um, we identify this book as historically accurate. And so that then provides academics to come in and open it up and really kind of, uh, I guess, analyze it and put a real fine-tooth comb on there. You're not seeing that necessarily with the Lord of the Rings. Well, okay, actually you are. A lot of people do analyze that book, and a lot of, I think they teach classes on it. But let's say something like Harry Potter or something, right? Like there's a reason why that book is also influential. And I'm not comparing the two. I'm just saying that there's something within that book that resonates with the reader. And of course, it's fiction, so you're not having people meticulously analyze it. But again, there's incredible truths held within the Bible, but it is identified as being that historically accurate piece of work. Do you think that that's really necessary, or do you think that the real gist and the meat and potatoes of the Bible are the truths held within?
Yeah, I think that the purpose of the Bible is to convey a spirit, to convey an attitude, a posture of the heart. That I think is the core mission purpose of the Bible. Um, and I think that is totally accomplishable without um, viewing it as mainly historical. I do my view on this has changed a little bit since I wrote it. I think at the time I wrote it, I would have been the way I wrote it very much was sort of all the way on that liberal spectrum of saying, you know, it could all be fiction, quote unquote fiction, and it would still be, just as Christian, just as good. I think that there is a there is a need for some things to be um, historical, even in the modern sense of like because the point of the spirit is that it has connected with and suffused concrete material reality. So if you say that certain key elements are not historically true, then you're saying that the spirit is only ethereal and mental, but doesn't actually concretely manifest. So, I could see people argue either way a little bit more on that, but I do think that, I mean, it says straightforwardly from Paul, if Christ did not rise, then the faith is in vain. So to claim that, well, Christ rising is just a allegory, I think that does diminish the reality of Christianity quite substantially. Whereas when you view it as a historical claim, you're not saying, I believe that historical scholars have proven this, and it's a definite historical fact that any whatever PhD has to recognize. Not on that sense of historical, but you're saying, I believe that material reality, our physical bodies are actually moment to moment subject to the infinite power of God, and they are within that the actual domain of his rule. So that while I have never seen it before me on, I haven't seen a dead person get up out of the grave after being 3 days dead, but I believe that the infinity of life uh, conquers everything, is supreme above all. So uh, there's a quote from Yogananda that I like that says something like, when you've seen the glory of God, it will not surprise you that a corpse could get up and walk," something like that.
Hmm. Yeah. I completely agree. There's that concrete manifestation that presents itself in reality that, it's like the word of God, the Bible is that anchor. It is that reflector, just like truth, because it is truth. So you can go through your life and then use this book, immerse yourself in this book. And not only are you getting historical accuracy, because I mean, Exodus, I mean, all this stuff is historically accurate, but you're getting stories of these people that I think it read for, and I think that's what provides the longevity as well, is that truth, is that accuracy of that deep resonance that I haven't felt with any other book that I've read. I mean, I haven't read, a whole lot, but I've read a fair share of books, and I mean, just picking that book up and not really even having an opinion on it or anything, but just open it up and start with John, start with the Gospel of John, and see what happens. It just it's so moving. And so that story, just like Louis Zamperini is a biopic, it was a real event presented as a story. The story of Jesus Christ is a real story. It's a biopic. It's a small period of his life, but it goes into incredible detail and teaches you how to properly live and interact in the world. And then you have people like Paul that picked it up and were able to spread it around and really integrate some organization behind it, which gave it some wheels, which gave it some foundation. And so we're this is a direct result of that. Um, And so I think that completely refutes the notion that Harari presents in, although our essence might not necessarily be a story. I mean, we are immersed in story, and that's how we conceptualize life, and so we need to absorb these stories, and then they become a part of you in a sense, right? So, I mean, when you're a kid growing up and you watch Luke Skywalker, you watch Indiana Jones, you watch The Lion King, Simba, you can on some level identify with these fictional characters and then not necessarily be them, right? But if you look at somebody that is expressing high morals or they're virtuous and you say, "Oh, I want to be like that." You know what? I'm gonna hold the door open for the old lady.
Mhm.
I'm gonna put her, give her a piggyback ride across the street, and stop oncoming traffic. You know what? It's it becomes a part of you in a sense like that. And just like if you watch horror movies all the time. You watch I don't know, you watch fight videos or whatever some violence. Again, these things which are stories, right? There's a beginning to the fight, a middle and an end to the fight.
Mhm.
You're absorbing that information and kind of that the energy behind that. And I think that it becomes you. But nonetheless, whether it's good or bad, it's a story and it has an effect on you. Um,
Yeah.
if we can, let's say going back to Harari describing the essence, a little after the next couple pages, you start talking about the soul and kind of the importance of the soul. Would that be then considered maybe the essence that he was referring to, which I highly doubt considering his nihilistic tendencies. Um, but could that be maybe an essence?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, he's highly influenced by Buddhist teaching, even if he's got it kind of backwards or distorted. So, and then the soul is different things in different traditions. So he, I think he's talking about a spiritual experience of oneness. Like that's fair. And I think lots of people have experienced that. And it's a subjective experience of the present moment. So since it doesn't have extension in time, you could make the argument that it's not a story. Now you're always going to refer back to it and think about it. As long as you're outside of it, you'll think about it as a story, as a place that you were, a thing that you've experienced, a truth that you need to spread, a place that other people need to get to, whatever it is. So uh, so I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt that he experienced something real, but that kind of goes back to the one of our points last time, and one of the uh, points to Christianity is that um, even what I think it's John, maybe Paul, but in the New Testament it says, even the demons know that God is one. Demons are well aware of the oneness behind things. So just because someone says, "Oh, there's a great oneness," or "I know about the oneness," or whatever it is, doesn't necessarily mean that they are uh, on the path of salvation. Um, so that ties into the pre-lust issue that we were talking about last time, the bad spiritual experiences. So there are people, I mean, just case in point, her, I really don't. We're picking on him quite a bit, but he sort of
Yeah.
lays it out there and has a bestseller. So
Yeah.
I think he's deserved at this point. But he makes this case of, well, meditate and open your heart chakra essentially, and yeah, which by the way is a story. Um,
Mm.
and then you'll experience the great thing and this, that, and the other. But then also human beings have no rights, and everyone's an annoying hunter-gatherer who can't really understand complex things, and we need more education. And uh, basically, nationalists are ruining the world because they won't accept a one world government, and they ruined Hillary Clinton's election because they're all Pizzagate wackos, and it's just like, okay, like maybe go meditate some more or not because I don't know if it's helping, but just yeah, I mean, just the fact that you've had a profound spiritual experience is wonderful and like, hey, keep at it. But that doesn't mean that everything you then pontificate on is pure gold, which, hey, that applies to me too. So, it goes all around. But gosh, it's just hard to deal with that much conflicting nonsense and a book that says everything's meaningless and we shouldn't care about stuff, and but then we should do all these social programs because whatever reason. And so anyhow,
Yeah.
that's Harari.
That's Harari. Those are good friend Harari. And it's interesting that there's an intersection here because I mean, considering a lot of the content of this channel outside of this walkthrough, um, the reason why I would dog on Harari would be for other reasons, but uh, this is one that, again, I'll look at it as objectively as possible in the context of the subject that we're reading through, and to kind of look at him with fresher eyes. But nonetheless, but it's very difficult, Rob. I'm going to be honest with you, considering some of the quotes that he has. And I've read that book as well, the 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. And again, yeah, it's maybe I can almost see why why he doesn't really isn't really partial to stories, because I don't really feel like that book was really constructed in any meaningful way. It was just kind of a bleh, and again,
Yeah.
meaning, right? Yeah, so we can kind of dog on him a little bit. It's okay. It's all right. I think he'll be okay. We're not being overly doggish. We're just having a little fun. We're just having a little fun. Um, okay, so enough about Harari. Is there a connection between the soul and consciousness?
um yes, there is some connection. Whether we know what that connection is or not is kind of debatable. But the what is certainly true is that as we have consciousness, we tend to uh, therefore come up with the idea or the story that we have a soul. The notion of a soul is something that resonates with our consciousness, that rings true, that seems to speak to something that most people are familiar with. In fact, uh, I believe it's Paul Bloom. I can't remember if it's in his book or it's research that he did, but there's some specific research on the idea that the concept of a soul is actually an evolutionary product. So you could make a materialist case for the idea itself in that sense. And it's really only like there are people who are like, well, I don't believe I have a soul, but that's just people who are milled through the modernist story to see things, to see that as superstitious nonsense. And they've been taught all these specific arguments. Like, okay, fine. Even if all that's true, it's still true that unless you're taught those things and to start doubting the soul, like the assumption, the natural inclination we have is that there's something that is worth, that needs a name that we might call a soul, we might call the self, we might call whatever. People have different names for this sort of feeling, but that there's a a what you might say a potent essence that is not identical with your body, but that is part of your life, something like that. So
It's like there's an aspect of us, of the individual, or I guess, yeah, for lack of a better term, an essence that is outside of this experience of this reality, um and even to conceptualize it is difficult. It's like a tooth trying to identify that it's a tooth. Um it doesn't really it's just it's extremely difficult. But like you said, there seems to be a hinting at, or there's an intrinsic, like we're there's an alluding to it almost, an extra sense of knowing, an inner knowing that there is an aspect of the individual that transcends this existence. And I think it's extremely comforting to have that. I think a lot of people that don't, that like you said, are stuck in this kind of materialist, modernist, nihilist uh, illusion. They don't have that, so there isn't really an anchor to hold on to, and that's even just trying to conceptualize that of like, well, okay, what if there is nothing? It's just, it brings a sense of dread, and so to don that on as being your go-to, lens that you see reality through. I mean, that must be an extremely hellish existence, you know? Uh,
Yeah,
yeah.
go ahead.
Oh, uh, and so I think that through having that idea that there is something that transcends this existence is not only uh, is it helpful in your everyday, but then also you want to live rightly, because you just not only you do you want to um I think we touched on this earlier. It's like because we can't properly conceptualize it, we can't, it's greater than us, and there's a sense that it is good, then I mean, just through thinking logically, I guess, or using reason, you want to follow that line as well. It feels frictionless. It feels like you're going with the flow. Whenever you experience something where the outcome induces shame or guilt, that's there's a lot of friction there. There's a lot of there's that obstacle of having to overcome that, and you're not in proper alignment when that happens. And so I think that even through that shows, if you're going through an action and the outcome is a feeling of guilt and shame, then there's an aspect of you that identified that and noticed that it was an incorrect behavior. And so the feelings of guilt and shame are induced as a result of that. But if there wasn't anything there, if you were just kind of this autonomous, being going through the motions, those feelings when looking at the past, I don't think would be there or be nearly as prevalent. Um, yeah, so I think that there is a soul. I think that we have souls, and I think that one of the purposes of being here is salvation, is to live that rightly life, and at the end, hopefully receive that salvation and live fully. Um, Now you speak also of Buddhism when you refer to the soul. Is there a belief in the soul in Buddhism?
Well, it's difficult to say. There's a lot of stories that seem to hinge on the reality of a soul, like stories about reincarnation, stories about other realms. And how do you conceptualize another realm that you could exist in other than supposing that you have some sort of essence that would then inhabit that realm? Um, and same thing, if there's a sequence of lives, what is it that connects the lives and makes them your lives, if not an overarching soul? At the same time, in terms of philosophy, Buddhism uh, at least seems to direct itself against the idea of some sort of lasting soul, because that would be something that you could call a self. And the Buddhist teaching is that there is no self. So in that sense, there's no soul. Um, so the this brings us, though, I think, to the issue, and the reason why I'm talking about it in the book is that Not that I'm trying to make an adamantine case for the soul to say, here's exact, you have a soul, and here's why you have to believe that on a rational basis. My case is much more pragmatic, and it's that the true stories that we need to tell are going to involve speaking of a soul. Just like even if Buddhists want to be supposedly anti-soul, you read almost any of their literature beyond just the foundational texts, and they imply the reality of a soul. So this is just how we function when we like I said, when we imagine heavenly realms, whatever it might be, alternate worlds, we are imagining some sort of body, whether it's a physical body or an etherical body, existing in this other realm, and we are imagining that somehow there is a connection between this experience and that imagined experience. If it hypothetically manifested, there would be a chain from here to there. And so that all implies the idea that there is this unifying connector between those things. And that's essentially part of what we would call a soul, or part of our reason we would reach for the idea of a soul to fill that gap. So, um, I like Buddhist philosophy, um, and I don't know the answer to whether we, whatever you want to say, objectively have a soul, whether there's a specific local, well, maybe not even localized, but let's say localized entity or limited entity, let's say, that we could describe as a soul or that we would describe as a soul. I don't know. But I do think that we anytime we relay a story that's going to be beneficial, that's going to be focused on the uh, infinite potential, infinite promises of God and our significance and the hope that we have in the future, I think the idea of a soul is going to go along with that. I think you're going to use the terminology, the concept of a soul in order to tell stories or tell effective stories, I should say. So that is the reason why I'm bringing it up. Is saying I'm going to tell you a story. It's going to imply the existence of a soul, but not just with the concept of a soul, but with the concept of a soul and with other things. I'm telling you a story. I'm not giving you a uh, a technical manual that you're supposed to analyze and infer from. It's a story. It's a imagistic rendering that's supposed to convey a spirit. So that's where I'm coming from in this whole discussion on the soul.
And that makes sense. That maybe that's where that resonance comes from, is because, on some level, like you said, most stories that have kind of this resounding uh resonance through time does have something to do with the soul on some level. And so I think that kind of answers the question as well, as perhaps yes, there is that soul.
Mhm.
Um, Now, interesting. Uh, so before we go into the actual story that you bring up in the second part of the chapter, you also talk about monism and dualism. Could you kind of touch on that as well?
Yeah, that's right in line with the discussion we've been talking about. So this is just a more philosophical, more rationalistic approach. The debate between monism and dualism is the question of are you, whatever we mean by you, are you of one essence or are you of two essence? Are you body as one thing and soul as another, or are you a unified, singular entity, let's say. And this historically, this debate was essentially framed with the idea of, okay, if you're a religious person, you believe you have a body and a soul. These must be separate things because body's material, and clearly material is not spiritual. So therefore, these are two separate things. And then the opposing side would either be some obscure philosophers who believed in idealism, which would mean that nothing is really material. Everything is just mental. Like we're living in a mental construct, and there's no reality to materiality. That would be one side of monism of everything is an idea or everything is mental. Or more commonly, there were the people who believed everything is material. There is nothing outside of the material. And so those were the mainline monists, and they would say, no, we're clearly a unitary being, and there's no evidence for spiritual stuff anyways. And plus, the dualistic story doesn't make sense. And they're right that the dualistic story does not make sense. There's just a fundamental problem with saying, um, I'm a body and a soul. Well, clearly my experience, as far as we're generally aware, is unitary. I mean, you can meditate and it's not quite so unitary, but we like to think of ourselves as cohesive and coherent and unitary. And then on top of that, there's the issue of even if we accepted for whatever reason that we were of two essences, then how does the one essence affect the other if they're completely different? If there's material on the one side and there's spiritual on the other, how does my action in the material body affect my soul when they don't touch? So this is a really powerful argument, and it's caused a lot of problems for the ideas of a soul. But I think it comes back to this, just the historical context in which it arose, where there was this presupposed separation where everything spiritual is spiritual and completely not material, and everything material is completely material and not spiritual. And it kind of touched on stuff we've talked about already, like Christianity being about the spirit completely suffusing the material. So I'm pro monism. I believe that we are of one essence, but I don't mind the idea of a soul because I don't view the idea of body and soul as these two dualistic things. I think essentially the Buddhist argument that there's no dividing line between immaterial soul and material body. You could say from an idealistic perspective, you could say, well, materiality is at its base all mental construct. I might agree with you, but I don't see a reason to reject the idea of material reality. I mean, obviously, when you stub your toe, it hurts. Your body generally heals in a particular way that's governed by material rules. Like, there's definitely not strong evidence or effectiveness to pretending that material reality is imaginary. So that's back to the illusion idea. So anyhow, uh, the monism dualism is this debate that seems to point away from the soul, but I think it really only does that because of the historical context of it. And I think that we should continue to talk about a soul while saying, yes, obviously, we can't fundamentally be dual in essence, whatever that would have mean. I mean, just the word essence sort of conjures an idea of a single top hierarchy, not a splitness. So it doesn't really make sense to talk in that way. But that's that in any case, that's not what I'm saying. And I don't think that's what we should be saying when we're talking about a soul. We shouldn't be talking about something that is entirely different somewhere else, undetectable, and not interacting with what's going on here. That doesn't make sense. Obviously, like we talked about the last couple times, your soul working out your salvation, whatever it is, involves work in what we call the material world. So whatever we want to decide how it, whether the material world is material or not or whatever, clearly your physical body is incorporated in the work of your soul. Like that is a necessity. You know, reading books, talking about things, thinking about things depend on what we call the material body to do material body stuff. So,
Exactly it. I think it's kind of like a Venn diagram, right? Where you can have the soul being completely spiritual, and then you can have the body being completely material. Uh, and they can be completely entwined and intermeshed in ways that we can't comprehend. Just because we can't see it with our five senses or properly identify it, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. There isn't that overlapping, that connection. Um, on some level, we could be the physical manifestations of our soul, to an extent, and to claim that reality is an illusion. I mean, maybe if you were to get an objective view on it at some point, maybe through, remerging with your soul, on a level, then you can say, okay, yeah, that might have been unimportant, now that you have a different perspective. But while we're in this existence of life, it's extremely dangerous to say that it's meaningless and it's
yes,
purposeless, and
yes, absolutely.
it's an illusion, it's Maya, because then again it ties into the level of engagement. There's clearly a reason why we're having this experience, and there's continual encouragement to engage on some level always, and it's like you have to go out of your way to not engage, you know
Yes,
um and so I think, again, like just going with the flow, not causing friction, not detouring off the path, on such a grand scale. I mean, of course, you have to bump, you have to know where the barriers are, where the parameters are, in order to properly fine tune and adjust your path. And that comes with being fallible, and that comes with causality, right? You know, okay, if this, then that. I know if I go there, I'm not going to wind up in the right spot, but if I go this way, we're going to get to where we need to go. So I think that idea of monism and dualism, of it having to be either or. You can't connect the two. You can't say that soul is spirit, body is material, and they're two completely different things. Just the way that I feel, the way that I sense it, what my inner knowing tells me is that it's completely intermeshed. And you can't have one without the other, like we've been talking about, um, that that union, that intimacy of the finite and the infinite. It's also on that same level. There's that connection, that intertwining, that causality even between the soul um and the body.
yeah, yeah.
Excellent. Okay, so that pretty much, unless you have anything else that you wanted to talk about, regarding that first section of the chapter. No,
No,
okay.
that leads us right in.
So now we can go ahead and talk about the story itself. So Rob, just to kind of get some clarification and just, I guess, some reference as well. What could you just kind of, I guess, give us an introduction of the story?
Yeah, yeah. So the story is called Game Theory. Okay. In the book, I lay out, a couple of things I'm consciously touching on and referencing and pulling on. But the idea is that life is a grand game. You might say that the infinite plays the video game of life. It's like a Ready Player One thing, but uh, God's player one, right? And then uh, the game of life is his creation. Um, so, and you could take this a couple other ways too, but the idea is that we are in the midst of a story, a movie, a game. And the main point of the story is thinking about and trying to understand how we could see a positive relationship between the director of the events or the programmer of the game and the characters of the story who go through things where you're like, I mean, why why is this something where why is this one of the storylines? Like, why is this a quest line? This kind of sucks, or this really sucks, or this is, actually hellish and unmanageable. Um, I meant to say unimaginable, but unmanageable works as well. So that's the setup. Is we're introducing this idea, and then we're trying to address the the feeling of suffering, the dislike of suffering, and the fact that there is suffering, and that we live in a fallen world. I mean, I think that's another one of those things, like the idea of a soul, regardless of whether you're Christian now or not Christian now, or any of the cultures in the past that weren't Christian. Everyone had to have this approach to talking about life in their mythology of why are things so messed up? Why does it suck so much of the time? Um, and so we have this sense of like things aren't as they should be, or things aren't as they could be, maybe. And what's up with that? Like, why can't we fix it? Why doesn't it just go back to how it should be? Was it ever how it should be? What stopped it from being? So all those questions imply this sense that things are off. So we clearly recognize that things are off. So how then, as especially as modern people, if we're coming back around, many people in the atheist community come back around to the idea of God, and basically are just, see nothing but reasons for anger at him. Like, why would we worship a God who allows child sex trafficking or whatever it is? And that's a good question, So this story is meant to be a story, first of all. It's intentionally a story, and then but it's an attempt to engender that spirit that maybe could answer that question, that type of perspective, that sense of understanding where you could go, oh, I kind of get that, or that kind of makes some more sense.
And I think it's in this part. That might be in the second. That might be in the second where you discuss the question isn't necessarily why do we suffer, but how do we ease suffering?
Yes, yeah. So that's where it starts out. So, or I'd say that's the second step. The first step is the idea that the infinite, the perspective that the infinite has on life is both from the view of the outside looking in, like someone reading a comic book or watching a movie or playing a video game, sort of the bird's eye view or the third person view, you might say, third person omniscient. But it also an intimate personal perspective of looking out from the eyes of a character and understanding that perspective too. So that's an idea that I'm floating out there. Okay, that's some of the capacities that the infinite has in terms of its consciousness and its ability to understand what's going on in our game. Okay. And then as it's going through this view, if it comes across a character who has this lament, I mean, one of the books of the Bible is Lamentations. Many of the Psalms are these cries out of pain and suffering. I mean, Jesus on the cross is praying one of the Psalms that starts off, my God, why have you forsaken me? And this is in the Bible. This is in a Psalm because this is a regular experience that we have. So then the idea is, how does God answer someone who's crying out like that? And we actually have, again, in the Bible, we have an example of Job's having a terrible time and he's crying out to God. And basically, when God finally answers, he's like, dude, you don't know what you're talking about. I'm way bigger than you, and you can't even possibly comprehend me. So just stop it. Like that's not uh, it's not an answer of like, oh, I'm so sorry, I'll make it all okay. It's just like, dude, you don't know what you're talking about. Stop it. So but, when we think about that separate from the story and consider it intellectually and analyze it and try to psychologize God, then we come, well, that's a terrible answer. And boy, like, it's probably a different experience to actually be in the presence of God and have him tell you the obvious truth that you don't know what you're talking about, and he does. But anyhow, that's not something that people, it doesn't click for people. So and God would know this. So if God's going through this game and he finds someone crying out, what's he supposed to do? What can you say to the person? And that's what you were talking about, where there's this idea of the person's crying out and saying, why do we suffer? Well, there's not really an answer for that, because any answer is going to any direct answer to that is going to include the presuppositions of that question of suffering is terrible. I don't want to suffer, and I can't bear this, and I shouldn't have to bear that. Whatever endless list of things, um, which are important from our perspective, but again, we have a limited perspective. So to try to reach us on that level would be to concede to us maybe too much. And so in the story, I propose a couple ideas of like, well, you know, let's say we're playing a video game and we're an avatar, we're a character wandering around, and we're like, hey, wait a minute, this sucks. Like, I don't know. For me, it's a big game was Halo or Skyrim.
Yeah.
Like, just imagine that you were uh whatever, your character in Skyrim, and suddenly you became self-aware, and you're like wandering through a dungeon, picking through bones for like weird objects, and
Huh.
there's like zombie skeletons running at you, and you're almost dying, and like I don't want to do this. This is not fun, you know? So like, what would you say if your character just turned around on the screen? If let's pretend you didn't freak out and were like, "Is this a dream or a drug trip or something?" But if your character turns around and is like, "Hey, I don't know why we're doing this, but I don't want to play this game," you'd just be like, "This is the game we're playing. Like, what are you talking about? This is the game. Like, we do this stuff and we're getting stuff. You're going to be fine. I've got the potions. I've got you saved. We can go back if you die. Like, we're good." You know, but from his point of view in the game, he's like this isn't fun, you know? So so there's not really a direct way to answer that question. Um, so then I think what we have to realize is while we might formulate it intellectually, people make all sorts of arguments about how God can't be both all good and all powerful because of how terrible the world is. But I don't think the question of why do we suffer or why is there suffering or why does God allow suffering, whatever variation of it is, I don't think that that's actually an intellectual question. We can use our intellect to make it appear so, but I think it's actually a expression of dismay. It's an emotional expression of basically saying this isn't fair. I don't like this. You're just expressing this attitude of rejecting the darkness of the world and objecting to being involved with it, being put through it, or whatever combination of the two. Um, so we we can't answer that question. Why is there suffering? We can offer, a hypothesis, a short story of saying, well, actually, they're suffering because but you chose to be here or whatever it is, and you knew ahead of time, you gave consent, and that's the soul idea. Your soul knew ahead of time, you gave consent, and now you're here and you don't remember that, but uh, that's how it is. And then, well, you can either believe that or not. But again, I still think what's happening is we're trying to answer on the intellectual level what is just an emotional cry. And I don't think that's the appropriate way to do it. So the best question to answer is, hey, here's the best thing that you can do in this situation. Here's the way forward. Here's the most practical steps. And here's the hope at the end of the line that you should keep in mind because it's there with you all along and it'll get you through. It's about, okay, like you had your little moment of despair, you know, pat you on the butt and keep you on, just push you toddling along the path some more. Just a reminder, okay, here's the things that you're doing. Go continue doing them. So I think that's really the appropriate answer to give. And then so the story is about the infinite sort of narrating that or coming to that decision that this is the appropriate answer to give, not a direct answer to the question, but here's what we need to do. Here's how we're gonna move forward in spite of the fact that it sucks sometimes or most of the time, whatever it might be. And so that leads us to the next part of the story.
It's like instead of just giving somebody a fish, you give them a fishing rod and teach them how to fish.
Hmm. Yeah. Yep.
So, in reference to how we alleviate suffering, um, what is the ways of doing that? I know that you touch on what is called the rule of sacrifice and the rule of eternity. Is that kind of the solution?
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm giving these two approaches, two parameters to dealing with suffering, the best way to deal with suffering. And I say you you have to play them both at the same time. These are uh, rules as in ways to play, not boundaries to the map, not things you can't break, but things that you want to do, um, something you want to abide by. So you have to actually play them both at the same time. And they're in a way a little bit paradoxical, but I think that they do mark out the whole territory. So the law of sacrifice is the idea that you can use effective action to move towards your goal, move towards the alleviation of suffering. So effective action could be just about anything, but the reason why it's the law of sacrifice is the idea that anytime that you are pursuing a particular thing or that you are um, trying one way or committing yourself to something, you're losing out on something else. And so fundamentally, if you want to assess a particular problem, you need to do particular things that apply to that problem, which means you aren't doing so many other particular things that you could be doing, and I mean, this gets really concrete. If I want my house or wherever it is, my work, not to smell like garbage, I need to take out the garbage at the appropriate times. That means I need to put my phone down and stop scrolling on YouTube and go get the garbage and take it outside. And it's windy and I'm afraid the garbage bag is going to rip. And there's all these, uncomfortable things that I don't necessarily want to be doing, but it gets me a better result in the end. And you can kind of stack, obviously, you can stack these things and you can do so much to move towards a better environment. And that scales greatly. And then there's obviously more complicated ones, but I think this goes down to you say evolutionarily back to the idea of ritualistic sacrifice, um, up to the idea of giving giving to charity, and um, hoping for the best. All of these and everything in between. I think all of these play a role in moving you in the appropriate direction and creating around you an environment that is going to lessen your suffering. So that's a long way of saying essentially you can problem solve, right? And then with the emphasis of problem solving, isn't necessarily just a selfish act. Actually, a lot of problem solving is selfless and requires sacrifice. It requires a long-term focus. It requires interaction with others, charity to others, all sorts of stuff. So problem solving or the law of sacrifice is one rule that'll get you pretty far.
That's a that's a really good point that you make, that emphasis on, and that ties again with the level of engagement. You know, I remember a couple of episodes ago, you were talking about how some Buddhist monks, in order, they had to rely on the people around them to feed them. They weren't able to actually go and get their own food. And so I guess that would be the receiving end of charity. Uh, but nonetheless, that requires engagement in the world around you rather than being fully invested on intrinsic growth. An aspect of growing intrinsically as well is interacting with the world around you. And so I think that really hit home with me as well, looking at that law of, or the rule of sacrifice being, you know, that struggle with the suffering or the obstacle, that level of engagement, knowing that it is uncomfortable or knowing that you're going through an experience that isn't necessarily one that you want to go through, but you know that there's an outcome, a potential outcome on the other side that is going to have direct benefit on you and others around you. And so I think that also ties in with again that alleviation of suffering. You are not only engaging to alleviate the suffering of others, but as a result, that also reduces your own personal level of suffering because there's that inherent purpose and engagement in that activity. Um, and so I guess that law of eternity is kind of the other end of the spectrum. It's kind of that it's that embodiment of living on that correct spiritual path. Am I getting that right?
Um, so I think it's hard to say because usually when we think of the correct spiritual path, we're thinking about
Yeah, that's
uh, discernment and honing and particularizing, and that's part of the law of sacrifice. But
mhm.
the law of eternity, they really aren't separable, and that's something I talk about a little bit. So it is part of the path, ironically, at the same time as being something that's sort of above the path and transcendent of the path. Um, so the law of eternity, um, you might say, is the ultimate goal. And so it's sort of like forever infinitely in the future, but at the same time, somehow it has resonances in the moment. So when we say like, you know, you're doing effective action and you have a hope for reward, the short-term fruit of effective action is one of the rewards that you hope for. Like there are material things that you can gather, that you can distribute, that you can work with. There are material obstacles that you're working through. That's all part of the law of sacrifice. That's effective action, and skillful action and learning and that sort of stuff. Um, so in a way that entails reward as well. But then the ultimate reward, is something that there's this paradox of like, yes, you're working towards it, but also as part of the law of sacrifice, but also this is the law of eternity, and it's about the eternal reality of that reward, which means being an eternal reality means it's not something you're creating, it's not something you're earning, and it's something that is already present in a way. So the law of eternity is the well, St. Paul says, um, I believe that none of something like I believe that none of the sufferings we're experience in this life are comparable to the glory that awaits us. So there's this idea of moving towards something, gaining something, and achieving something, but he's also talking about a reality that is so transcendent and so all-encompassing and engulfing that it washes away even the current sufferings that we have. So it is about this transcendence and this breakthrough of another level of reward, you might say, and indeed the ultimate and the infinite reward. So the law of eternity is not about something that you do, it's about ringing the bell, the reminder, the resonance that the ultimate gift is already given and is present and is all redeeming. And therefore, whatever's going on pales in comparison to that. Even if it seems dim and far away, if you hear, even if you just hear it ringing a little bit, it brings it that much closer and does have a temporal effect as well as that eternal reality.
And so would you say then that yes, there is that connection between the two because if you're not engaging correctly, if you're not acting charitably, if you're not alleviating suffering in others, then the outcome on the level of the soul, I guess, which is what we could be speaking. I mean, it's another reference to potentially to the soul and the body. Um, that then one wouldn't achieve salvation. One wouldn't be walking the correct path. Therefore, they wouldn't reap the rewards that delayed gratification can bear.
Yeah, yeah. So the I mean, we have to be careful about saying achieve salvation. You know, you can't achieve
Right,
the
right.
infinite, but there is this mysterious connection of, you can't really move away from the infinite eternal.
It's attain would be the word.
Right. And then yet at the same time, you can do things that make you feel more distant. Or, I think it comes back to the law that Christ lays out in the Lord's Prayer, where he says, um, uh, forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. And after that, after saying the prayer, he tells people through two parables and tells them directly, like the judgment that you use against others is going to be used against you. So while, yes, eternity is a gift and eternity is given, if you are going about your individual life and you are acting in a way that says, you don't really care for the purpose in your body and your life or the purpose of others, and you think everyone else is a dumb monkey, uh, caveman, whatever.
NPC.
NPC, yeah, exactly. That's on point. You think everybody else is a mindless NPC, then when you when you have the chance to hear the bell ringing for the infinite to shine forth, you're going to have demons around you. And those demons are going to be whispering in your ear, hey, you don't belong here. Remember that time you were acting like that dumb NPC? Like you're going to start to see things about yourself, and you're going to start to react to yourself just the way you would react to, or the habitual way you've reacted to everybody else. And you're going to count yourself as not worthy, just as you've been counting everybody else as not worthy.
Hmm.
So there's a self-fulfillingness to it, and you can sort of theorize and be like, well, you could get around that by, insert whatever cheat code. But, I just don't think that's how it works. So I think that hopefully that helps illustrate the connection. You still can't delineate it because, well, the eternal is eternal and ever present. So how do you miss out on it? How do you move towards it? How do you gain or attain it? Well, you don't, but at the same time, the infinite eternal has, well, it's made purpose and form, and it has an intimate interest in our lives. So there's a what? There's a direction that you're supposed to be going, or at least there's some directions that you're not supposed to be going. And if you just keep on going in those directions, then uh, there's real consequences to that.
That was very well said. Um, it brings me to 298. Bottom of 298. And the magnitude of the effect is determined by the level of consciousness attained by the individual, the degree to which he or she can be aware of this reality and consciously feel the resonance emerge in and creep through his or her being. And so I think that I guess higher level of consciousness is attained through the rule of sacrifice. Would that be kind of a decent assumption where, I mean, I guess you can't necessarily give a specific measurement to uh fluctuating levels of consciousness if you can, you know, gain higher and you can lose some. Um, you can't necessarily measure that, but one would think that the way that you're engaging in reality has a direct result on your level of consciousness.
Yeah, I think so. I also think it's a paradox. Like you need the law of eternity. You need the fact that you are the kind of being who has the ability to have higher levels of consciousness,
Mhm.
and you need you need to be been programmed or structured in that way, and then that means that eternity, God has to have uh, decided to be present with and intimate with, all the way down to you. Um, so it's not all just, well, I can, you know, level myself up.
Right.
And, I don't want to, again, this is a story. I don't want to imply that there's some sort of training regimen where you can do the things and get the levels up, on a scheduled timeline and a predictable timeline, and you can be in control of when you level up or anything like that. I don't think that's exactly how it works. I do think that your action is significant. I do think that the inputs on your material level do affect your consciousness on some level.
Mm.
Um, but I don't think it's gameable in that sense.
Right. Right. I mean, it would just one would think that by engaging in right action, right behavior, that um, the, I guess, the door or the window would be open. I mean, that's kind of saying, okay, well, if you do, you can't specifically say, oh yeah, you're going to gain 20% higher consciousness if you engage in this activity. No, but I mean, you can say, okay, well, if you sit on the couch and watch Jerry Springer all day eating Ben and Jerry's, uh,
Right.
playing with your belly button, you're probably, I mean, I can't say, but on one side of the spectrum, the other would be okay. Are you donating time to uh, a helpful cause? Are you donating money? Are you speaking about God, about Christ to others? Are you engaged in um, compassionate activities? Are you in communion with other people? That, versus the other, I guess you could kind of see, like we are just saying, you can't necessarily measure it, but I mean, I can, even from my own experience, if I'm watching, a crazy horror movie and I'm eating McDonald's, which I don't do. But let's say I did, I have in the past, I feel completely different as opposed to, eating, I don't know, eating a bowl of greens and watching an uplifting film, or engaging in good healthy behavior. It's like and we talked about this in another chapter. It's not like it's rocket science. I mean, go out and get some sunlight, get some small wins under your belt. Uh, and I think that's the other big thing is not to deviate off topic, but um, allowing yourself to achieve those small wins, to say, okay, I'm going to do something and then actually follow through, and learning to trust yourself. Because if you have these crazy, grandiose dreams, but all you're doing is sitting on the couch playing with your belly button, this stuff's not going to come about. It takes that action, it takes that engagement for these things to come to pass. And again, it also takes time. So it takes patience. Um, and it takes one to be kind. You have to be kind to yourself. And like you said, the way that you treat others is the way that you treat yourself. It's like this interconnection. And so if you're internally judging others, uh, in a hostile way, and then you perform a similar action, that same energy that you're putting on others for engaging in that behavior is going to be redirected right back into you.
Yeah.
So how then do you get to a level to where you're speaking to yourself, or you're not judging yourself in a negative way? How do you get those demons off of you? And I think a big part of that is to express forgiveness, to express, to have grace, to have patience for other people, uh, and to know, what was the parable where they wanted to, they wanted to stone the woman, and Christ said, ye who are sinless, you cast the first stone, similar to that.
Right.
Um, and I think that rings true, and that's why it's so profound. It's because it's absolutely true. I mean, that's why it makes, that's why it's it's gone through time as much as it has. Um, I also wanted to talk about real quick the connection, if there is one, because you alluded to this towards the end of the chapter here. Um, to be here in this game means to at least have periods throughout life where that consciousness is dim at best. So there's that level of contrast there because you may be engaging in right behavior and feeling really good and feeling that connection to the infinite, that divine connection. And then if let's say then down the line you revert to uh poor behavior, you might be able to sense that on some level of, okay, well, something's off. I wonder what it is. Maybe it's the behavior that I've done in the past. So do you think that there is that potential fluctuation in consciousness that an individual might be going through?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that's the back to the story of Job. Like,
Yeah.
he's like, I'm doing everything right. Things are just crappy right now. And all of his friends are like, no, 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 you've done something wrong. That's why this is happening. He's like, no, I've been doing everything right. It's just a crappy time. It's a real crappy
Yeah.
time. And I think, and then the friends don't want to accept that because that reflects this level of vulnerability of like, we can do everything right and things can still go really wrong. And it can really suck. And they're just, you're not in control and you can't just, you know, sit down and meditate and enter into bliss absolutely every time you want to, throughout your entire life. You know, there's going to be some times where you don't have that connection.
Yeah.
And I think, I think that's kind of the definition of this world, of the fallen world, is that, we suppose these realms of heaven where, we'd always be consciousness of the glory and always be just enveloped in gratitude and that stuff. But in this world, that consciousness is rare and fleeting for the most part. Um, and so I think there's not really anything to do about that. Unfortunately, the answer is just, well, if you have some idea, some faith in the reality of eternity, then those moments aren't going to not exist. They're not going to not be terrible, but you're not going to give up. I think that's the only difference in reality is that you'll have a little bit more metal to get you through. But even if it's not on you. You can be Job sitting on a pile of rubble, lancing your blisters and just being like, you know, I'm not here by my own accord,
Right.
obviously. Um, and if I wasn't religious, I'd probably hang myself, but I guess I'm just going to ride this one out. It's not really on your strength at that point. It's just the momentum of life continuing.
Just going through it,
Yeah. Yeah.
typically there's that level of faith of that, that light there at the end of the tunnel, that regardless of what you're going through in the moment, there's that larger purpose, that grander story that's being unfolded that, you might not, I always hear the analogy of, when you're climbing a mountain or you're going on a hike, of course, the end result is going to be the top of that mountain, but there's plenty of valleys and hills, of course, a steep elevation. Um, so it's not necessarily all straight. It's not all
Right.
straight up. Um, you also say there is a minimum necessary level of ignorance to engage in the game of limitation, and thus there is an inevitable measure of suffering. And so I'm assuming so the game of love of limitation would be life itself, right? Because this is a finite
Yes.
experience. Um, so the tie then is a connection between ignorance and suffering, right? Because if you knew how to solve suffering instantly or how to alleviate it instantly, then you would know how to, then there wouldn't be ignorance. You would know
Right.
how to do it. And so and I think this goes back to what we were initially talking about towards the beginning of the chapter, and that is the importance of obstacles. So an obstacle typically presents itself because there is a level of ignorance, there's a barrier of ignorance that needs to be pushed through, like problem solving, what we were talking about. And so that suffering is induced due to a level of ignorance that you have the ability to, or that you must engage with to overcome to then break through that obstacle.
Mhm.
So I think there is that linking, and a lot of people get upset with themselves for being ignorant. Oh, I don't know how to solve this problem. This is a stupid game. I want to give up instead of admitting, okay, this is something that I don't know. There are plenty of things that I do know, but this is a challenge. This is gonna take a level of engagement. I need to put my attention and my focus on overcoming this. And that is fully engaging in reality because that obstacle has manifested itself in reality.
Right.
So you have to then imagine breaking through that obstacle and then manifesting that action into reality by actually breaking down that obstacle.
Right. Right. And then so that lends itself to more of the idea of the practical law of sacrifice side of things, but also on the spiritual level, there are just those times where you're in the dumps and
Right.
I mean, yes, there's things you can do, but um there's not really, you know, again, you can't just think, oh, I'm going to pray a nice prayer or I'm going to meditate, whenever I feel bad and I'm automatically going to enter the realm of bliss every time, for the rest of my life. Uh, this goes back again to the beginning of like, we're playing Skyrim. We're not playing, uh, Fluffy Bunny Time 3 or whatever it is.
Dang
Right.
it.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think I really think this is a useful mindset of like, if we design, the movies and the games that we design and that we seek out are the gritty, terribly hard ones where the hero gets put through just the ultimate grinder, you know, and we might let our kids play bouncy, fluffy cloud jump, extraordinaire, but those that we don't want to play that. That's boring. And I think that just applies on the level of life. Like right now, when you're in the dungeon crawl, it's grim and it sucks. And you're like, why would I want to do this? But from another point of view, whether after down the line or from an eternal point of view, you're like, this is an awesome game. This is an awesome story. It's going to be amazing. It's going to be beautiful on the other end. So this brings me to a quote that I think really sums up the whole story and the whole chapter. And it's where I say, this is the mysterious way of playing the game, knowing it's a game, and yet still being fully engaged in it. So you're
Yeah.
playing the game, you know you're playing a game, but you're fully committed and engaged in the game. And that I think is the mystery of the connection between the infinite and the finite and living it out.
Would that, in a sense, be similar to like lucid dreaming?
Yeah.
It's interesting. Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right about that. to know that you're engaged and then to actually act that out. And that not only dispels the ignorance but it doesn't say that there's necessarily not going to be any obstacles, but it allows you to engage with them from a position of power, you know,
Yeah.
um and again, not in like a crazy, like, you know, crazy level of power, but just inner power, you know, you have
Oh,
like a confidence, like confidence
yeah.
to overcome. Um, so Rob, is there anything else specifically in the chapter that you want to go over before we conclude?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. I do want to read the last couple of sentences of the chapter that I think are really good to close out. Um, and that is, have faith and remember that every little thing is going to be all right. But if you find yourself desiring a more beautiful path or playground, come this way. Yet the way is straight and narrow, and few find the gate, for life is a difficult game. And like you said, I mean, we don't want to play Fluffy Bunny, Hoppy Skipper, number two. We want to play Punch 'em Up, Explosion, Jump Around, five,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
much better game. Um, real quick before we actually shut down here, because I think that there's a decent segue. Uh, Next week, we're going to be going into the third part of the book, and that is going to be called Sticking to the Straight and Narrow. So without giving too much away, we are reaching towards the third part of the chat or the book here. And is there anything that you want to let people know, kind of I don't know, some theme going into this third chapter or this third part?
Yeah, we're going to be just talking a little bit more about some maybe common misconceptions. It's kind of like the other end of the bad mythology. It's like, well, now we're in the spiritual territory, and there's some common traps or bad mythologies on the spiritual side, and we're just going to try and cut some of those off or nip them in the bud. And I think this quote that leads off part three is a good illustration of that. So this is from Dr. Jordan Peterson. We cannot invent our own values because we cannot merely impose what we believe on our own souls. We rebel against our own totalitarianism as much as that of others. So this is the idea of, we need to look at the best image of the truth, the best approximation of reality that we can, not what sounds nice and not what we might hope to be true or um, what modern mythologies might push us to agree with. So we're just going to be trying to shore up some of the supports and cut off some of the cut out some of the weeds.
Man, I'm looking forward to it. It's going by, man. Um, okay, so this has been a discussion on chapter 14, A Modern Religious Story, for Robert B. Davis II's book, Purpose Inform the Necessary Basis of All Ethics. And you can find this book on Amazon. If you go to the search bar and type in Purpose Inform, you're going to also have to type in Rob's name in order for it to pull up. Otherwise, I am leaving a link in the description down below that you can access and pick up your copy and follow along. I'm also leaving a link to Rob's personal website, which has a list of all of his works, a little bit more about himself, and then also some Substacks. One that he is completed, Defund the Fun Police, and the other, Rob, if you want to just talk about it for a second, is your second book that you're releasing as a serial.
Yeah, it's called Living Under Controlled Abundance. Actually, the second to last chapter came out today. So the final one releases on Halloween. So
Ooh.
pretty soon, the end of this week, you'll be able to see the entire story end to end up there on the Substack. So coming
Check
right
it
up.
out. It's fantastic. If you like short stories or if you like stories in general, if you like works of fiction, I don't think Harari does, but we do. Give it a read. I mean, just it takes takes a couple hours. Give it a shot. Come on, it's excellent. And then also check out Defund the Fun Police. Um, so everybody, thank you for watching. Please leave a comment down below. Please give this video a thumbs up, and we will see you next week. God bless, and may peace be with you.